Welcome to my channel, where every song lyric, every movie scene, and every book page reveals its secrets. The dystopian novel 1984 is often called a handbook for those living through difficult times. The popularity of George Orwell's work, written in the mid-20th century, has noticeably increased in recent years. So why does it remain so relevant even today? That's what we'll try to figure out. The spread of military dictatorship in the 20th century did not escape the keen eye of writers, who were highly sensitive to even the slightest shifts in public opinion. Many authors took sides in the political struggles of their time, refusing to remain indifferent to the realities around them. Among the brilliant minds who embraced the ideals of humanism and individual freedom, so often trampled in authoritarian regimes, one figure stands out in particular: George Orwell, the author of the brilliant dystopian novel 1984. In his work, he portrayed a future that should be feared in any era. The novel presents a possible scenario for the future of the world. After a series of bloody wars and revolutions, Earth has been divided into three superstates that are in a constant state of war with one another. These endless conflicts serve to distract the population from unresolved internal issues and ensure total control over society. To understand 1984, it's important to start with the main character. The story takes place in one of these empires, where the protagonist, Winston Smith, works at the Ministry of Truth, a government institution responsible for rewriting history and erasing the past to fit new political narratives. It also spreads propaganda to uphold the values of the ruling regime. Every day, Winston witnesses how reality is being twisted to serve the interests of those in power, and he begins to question whether any of it is right. Doubt creeps into his mind, and he starts a secret diary where he confides his rebellious thoughts, hiding from the ever-watching eyes of the telescreens, which not only broadcast content but also surveil every corner of his home. This marks the beginning of his silent protest. In this new system, there is no room for individuality, so Winston hides his true self carefully. What he writes in his diary is considered a thought crime, a punishable offense that can lead to death. Hiding anything from Big Brother, the supreme leader of Oceania, is nearly impossible. The houses are made of glass, surveillance cameras and hidden microphones are everywhere, and the thought police monitor every move. Winston eventually meets Julia, a bold and free-spirited woman who also secretly clings to her individuality. They fall in love and begin meeting in the quarters of the proles, the lowest social class of workers. The government pays less attention to them, considering their intellectual level too low to pose a threat. The proles are allowed to live more traditionally, by old customs. In this relative freedom, Winston and Julia indulge in love and dream of revolution, hoping that the proles will one day rise up. Eventually, they come into contact with a man claiming to be part of the resistance. He gives them a forbidden book that outlines the philosophy of an upcoming revolution. But just as they begin reading it, the thought police burst in. The trusted rebel was actually an undercover agent. After enduring brutal torture, Winston and Julia break down and betray each other. By the end of the story, they have both been completely broken. They come to genuinely believe in the power of Big Brother and accept the official narrative, that everything in their country is just fine. The author wrote his work in 1948 and chose the title by simply reversing the last two digits of the year. At that time, the world was becoming increasingly familiar with the powerful military force emerging from the Soviet Union, one of the strongest in Europe. For many people, worn down by war and hardship, it began to feel as if one ruthless aggressor, Nazi Germany, had merely been replaced by another, equally dangerous and uncompromising force. Although the Third Reich had been defeated, the threat of a Third World War still loomed over the world. The legitimacy of any form of dictatorship became a hot topic of global discussion. Orwell, witnessing the terrifying consequences of authoritarian regimes and their unchecked power, became a firm critic of tyranny in all its forms. He feared a future in which despotic rule would erase the very notion of truth, where even the simple statement 2 + 2 = 4 could be outlawed. These fears for the future of civilization became the foundation of his dystopian novel 1984. Orwell envisioned the triumph of totalitarianism not in some distant future, but just 36 years ahead. The atmosphere of the time truly called for such dark predictions. Yet, ironically, many of them never came to pass, thanks in part to the powerful spread of humanist ideals through literature like Orwell's. Orwell's geopolitical system. The events of 1984 unfold in a country called Oceania. It has two constant rivals, Eurasia and Eastasia. Alliances shift, sometimes with one, sometimes with the other, while war is waged against the third. This constant state of war becomes a unifying force for internal order. External threats are used to justify food shortages, widespread surveillance, poverty, and other social issues. Big Brother is the supreme leader of Oceania. To keep everything looking seamless and consistent, workers at the Ministry of Truth rewrite yesterday's newspapers and reissue them with the corrected version of events. In this way, every failure of Big Brother is erased from history. His personality cult is deeply rooted and functions as the national ideology. He is like a god. His portraits and slogans are everywhere, serving as icons of loyalty and obedience. These details clearly reflect the geopolitical atmosphere of Orwell's time. INGSOC, English Socialism, is the ruling party, brought to power by Big Brother and Emmanuel Goldstein, a symbolic parallel to Lenin and Trotsky. INGSOC focuses primarily on psychological control of the population. The most important domain of control is people's thoughts. To ensure this, officials constantly rewrite history, even as recent as yesterday's news. Emmanuel Goldstein, the so-called opposition leader, represents the internal enemy of the party, which is the only political entity and symbolizes absolute power. Goldstein and his organization, the Brotherhood, are most likely fictional, a tool to attract those dissatisfied with the regime, only to have them arrested and tortured. It is within these imaginary circles of resistance that the protagonists of 1984 become entangled. Fake criminal cases and public hatred aimed at Goldstein serve to distract citizens, whose daily reality is already filled with violence and fear. Doublethink is one of the most absurd aspects of this political system. In Orwell's world, familiar words take on opposite meanings. The Ministry of Love handles torture and executions, while the Ministry of Truth spreads lies. The famous party slogans, "War is peace," "Freedom is slavery," "Ignorance is strength," are accepted as absolute truths by a population dulled by endless propaganda. Although these phrases are simply contradictory pairs, in the dictatorship's context, they gain ideological weight. War ensures internal stability. No one would start a revolution while the homeland is under threat. Peace is not a concern in times of war. The citizen's freedom lies in feeling safe and having nothing to hide. As long as the country is free, so is the individual. Therefore, blindly worshiping Big Brother brings true harmony. Ignorance supports this illusion because a person who knows nothing cannot doubt and can march toward a common goal without questioning anything. In this way, absurdity becomes a national ideal in many authoritarian states. Newspeak is the artificial language created by Oceania's linguists. It's a system of abbreviations and jargon designed to make thought crime, questioning the system, even linguistically impossible. The goal of Newspeak is to paralyze independent thought. After all, if there's no word for something, that concept ceases to exist in a person's mind. Without language, the characters in 1984 would be unable to express themselves, let alone rebel. The proles, or the working class, make up about 85% of the population. The authorities let them live with minimal control, believing they've been dulled by hard, primitive labor and are incapable of critical or revolutionary thinking. Their lives are guided by tradition, their beliefs shaped by superstition. Yet it is on their potential awakening that Winston pins his hopes for change. The Thought Police is a secret organization responsible for monitoring and controlling the mental activity of Oceania's citizens. Their job is to detect and punish even the slightest hint of dissent before it turns into action. Winston Smith, the protagonist of the novel, a 39-year-old employee of the Ministry of Truth. He is slim, unhealthy-looking, with a gaunt face and tired eyes. Winston is a person torn by inner conflict. On one hand, he hates the totalitarian regime, but on the other, he lacks the courage to openly rebel. His childhood, marked by poverty and selfishness, shaped him into a weak and indecisive character. However, his love for Julia sparks in him the courage to protest. Unfortunately, he cannot withstand the pressure. Under torture, facing his deep fear of rats, he betrays his beloved and ultimately submits to the system. In the end, his image as a fighter turns into that of a broken, conformist individual. Julia, Winston's beloved, a 26-year-old employee in the literary department who writes novels on an automated machine. Julia is the opposite of Winston. She is bold, brave, and openly rebels against the party's morals with her sexual freedom. Her protest is instinctual bodily, driven by a desire for pleasure and love rather than ideological change. She has dark hair, freckles, and an attractive appearance. O'Brien, a high-ranking member of the party, a secret agent of the thought police. He is well-mannered, composed, with a strong athletic build. He deliberately creates the impression of being oppositional. O'Brien plays a role similar to that of Mephistopheles in the story of Faust. He appears in Winston's dreams, planting seeds of doubt in his mind about whether he truly shares the political views of the majority. O'Brien constantly fuels Winston's rebellious thoughts and eventually persuades him to participate in a planned rebellion. Later, it is revealed that O'Brien was a provocateur all along. He personally oversees the torture of his friends, gradually stripping them of their individuality. Despite his cruelty, O'Brien possesses a rare charm, a clear mind, broad knowledge, and persuasive skills. His position is much more consistent and logical than what the prisoners try to oppose. Syme, a linguist, one of the creators of Newspeak. All secondary characters are depicted schematically by the author, primarily to highlight the injustice and corruption of the state system in 1984. The meaning of the book 1984. In 1984, George Orwell depicts the meaningless and ruthless battle between the individual and the system, where the former is doomed to destruction. The totalitarian state denies the individual's right to uniqueness, which means that everything we hold dear will be trampled upon if the power of the state over society is absolute. Orwell warns against the collectivism of thought and the permissiveness of dictatorship under any slogans that certainly should not be trusted. The meaning of 1984 is to present a world that has dialectically evolved, according to the laws of today, into a state of tyranny, and to show its degradation, its total mismatch with our values and ideals. Orwell takes the radical ideas of the politicians of his time to extremes, and what he creates is not science fiction, but rather a very real forecast for the future, a future we are unknowingly moving toward in the present. Every dystopia intensifies the imagery to make humanity reflect on what lies ahead if today's arbitrariness is allowed to persist. In the mid-20th century, Orwell saw many prototypes for Oceania. He was particularly harsh in his criticism of the USSR. He frequently spoke out in the press, criticizing the authoritarian regime of the country, its repressive domestic policies, its aggressive behavior on the world stage, and more. Many details from the book strikingly resemble the realities of the Soviet period in Russia. The cult of personality, repression, torture, shortages, censorship, and so on. It's possible that the work was a very specific satirical jab at the Soviet Union. For instance, it's known that Orwell came up with the famous line, 2 + 2 = 5, when he heard the phrase, a 5-year plan in 4 years. The ending of 1984 is deeply unsettling and tragic, highlighting the incompatibility between human nature and dictatorship. After enduring prolonged physical suffering, Winston Smith eventually admits that O'Brien is showing not 4 fingers, but 5, even though it's a lie. But the Inquisitor goes further in his experiments. He holds up a cage of rats in front of Winston's face. For Winston, this is beyond his ability to endure, as he has an overwhelming fear of rats. In a desperate plea, he betrays Julia, begging O'Brien to give her to the rats instead of him. However, Julia also betrays him under torture. Thus, the rebels against the system lose faith in each other, and their dreams seem nothing more than childish fantasies. They can no longer think of protesting, as their thoughts are completely controlled by the thought police. This crushing internal defeat contrasts sharply with Oceania's latest victory in the war against Eurasia. To the sound of triumphant fanfares, Winston sincerely comes to love Big Brother. Now he is a part of the universal conformity. The final scene takes place in a cafe, where Winston sees Big Brother's image on the telescreen and feels an overwhelming sense of love and devotion toward him. The book concludes with the famous line, "He loved Big Brother." The ending serves as a powerful reminder of the control totalitarian regimes exert over individuals, manipulating their thoughts and emotions. It is also a stark commentary on the human spirit and the capacity for individuals to either resist or succumb to oppression. Many readers find the conclusion deeply troubling and depressing, as it suggests there is no hope for meaningful change or rebellion against such overwhelming power. However, others argue that the book acts as a potent warning about the dangers of government control and the importance of fighting for freedom and personal autonomy. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more exciting discoveries.